Hello and welcome to the brand new Price of Football podcast with me, Kevin Day, and Kieran Maguire, football finance expert at Liverpool University. In each episode, we'll be following the money to find out what's really going on behind the scenes at your club, any club, in a league, a tournament or whatever, and we'll stand and fall by your questions. So anything you want to ask us football finance related, let us know on questions@priceoffootball.com. Now, the reason I wanted to do this pod in particular is that I have a very probably overly romantic view of football and its place at the heart of working class communities. And like most football fans, Kieran, I get so energised by financial things. You know, financial fair play rules, transfer fees, agents' fees, mega rich owners, clubs going out of business. And like so many football fans, I don't have the foggiest clue of how the finances actually work. I'm an international pub lawyer, but even I don't get how things work. But it doesn't stop me arguing and moaning about these things. But this is your world, kid. So tell us a little bit about your background and why you're the ideal person to talk to an idiot like me about the most important thing in football, unfortunately.
Well, I sort of fell into this by accident. I was doing some training for a firm of bankers who were advising the Glazer family in respect of Manchester United. Now, I didn't know that was taking place. Right. I just teach anywhere. And on that particular day, the deal went through in respect of United being acquired by the Glazers. And at about 3 o'clock, all the windows were shuttered. 12 bouncers appeared on the front gate because they were they feared that a bunch of Cockney Reds were going to turn out and put the windows out. Now, that didn't manifest itself. The same day, the BBC phoned up the university and said, Manchester United have just been taken over, £700 million. Does anybody have a clue what's going on? And the university just pointed at me to say he talks about football all the time in class. So it was purely by accident that arose. And then I was approached by Liverpool to teach on their football MBA course. I've always found as a lecturer that if I'm talking about Mercedes-Benz or Apple or Marks and Spencer's, students are their heads are nodding. They're trying to stay awake. You mentioned Manchester United. You mentioned Liverpool's finances, and all of a sudden everybody's energised because I've been fortunate enough to teach in both Manchester and Liverpool, two football-mad cities, and I just started bringing more and more football into what I taught, and now I just teach.
Presumably you don't tell each city that you're working in the other city as well, just in case.
Well, I try not to. Try not to.
When you started looking at finances of football in some detail, were you surprised, horrified, pleasantly gratified that it was in a good state in general?
Well, it's not in a good state. It's never been in a particularly good state. Whilst we all think that the Premier League makes an absolute fortune, only just over half the clubs are making a profit.
In the Premier League?
In the Premier League itself.
Only half?
Yeah. And then when you drop down into the lower leagues, as soon as you get to the Championship, the Championship is an absolutely crazy division. They lost £580 million last year between the 24 clubs. That's why there's problems at Bolton. That's why so many clubs are close to going under.
I'm going to have to ask you to say that again, Kieran, because that is an astonishing figure. Not only is that an astonishing figure, but I'm given to believe by Sky in particular that the Championship is, after the Premier League, the most successful football brand in the world, the most watched. And you're telling me that how much is owed across the clubs?
They lost £580 million between them. And therefore, if you're losing money, how are you going to make up those losses? You can either sell your players, but of course, as a fan, you don't want to because you want to see your club get promoted or make the playoffs or avoid relegation. Or you rely on the owners sticking money in. And there's lots of bad club owners, but in the Championship, there's lots of guys who are sticking in huge sums of money because they're chasing the rainbow. They're chasing the fact that the difference between the Premier League and the Championship is £100 million a year in terms of telly money.
Do you know what? I suspect as the weeks go by and we do this pod that I will keep saying to you, I thought what you said last week was the most astonishing thing. And you're going to tell me a different astonishing thing. I'd seriously having trouble digesting, even allowing for the fact that, of course, they're all chasing Premier League football. What about? Well, of course, they're not all got parachute payments, but I'm really having trouble digesting that. So that's across 24 clubs.
That's across 24 clubs, yeah.
And without naming names, and again, this is something we'll get used to as we do this pod, as I am only a pub lawyer, as I pointed out, there will be legal things. I suspect every now and again people at home will be going, that sounds like an edit. And that will be because I've accidentally said the wrong thing about the wrong person. But without naming clubs, are one or two clubs skewing that figure by having lost more than others, or is it pretty across the board?
Oh no, there are big losses and small losses. So the clubs which have tried to get promotion in recent years have lost a lot of money. They've used various devices to get around that. I think you might have heard about clubs selling their own grounds to the owners. That's
Derby County,
Sheffield Wednesday, Aston Villa, Reading, possibly Birmingham as well, for all we know. So there's a lot of that taking place, but you can only do that the once. So you've got to be a little bit careful about that. And the other thing which is nuts about the Championship is that for every £100 that comes in through the door, and that's from parachute payments, that's from Sky, that's from fans attending, that's from the commercial deals with all these gambling companies that now dominate, they're spending £107 in wages. So before you mow the grass, before you put on the floodlights, before you go and buy the cones, you've already made a loss. And everybody seems to think that's okay.
You've already touched on two issues that I suspect in weeks to come will be coming back. The Sheffield United case is a very interesting one with the two rival owners. The preponderance of gambling companies sponsoring, and I'm a Palace fan, and our sponsors two teams in the Premier League, which I always find slightly baffling. And it's a company that you're not entirely sure you'd want associated with your club, just in terms of their product. But there's a story that dominated the summer that I think horrified all football fans, and I think that's where we should start this podcast, really, and hope that it doesn't set the tone for podcasts to come. And we're talking about the demise of Bury. Now, people ask me why I didn't tweet about this, and I didn't tweet about it in the same way that I don't tweet when somebody I know dies, because I just hope that people assume that I'm beyond angry. People who don't understand football, who look at a purely economic point of view, don't understand what a football club means to the community. They don't understand what it means in terms of not just local businesses, but what it means to football fans. And as a Palace fan who've twice nearly been out of business, who were hours away from going out, I cried my eyes out when it was saved by the consortium. I'm not ashamed to say that. So I know what Bury fans would have gone through, but I was so angry, but at the same time, without being able to articulate what I was angry at, who I was angry at, whether I was more angry at the EFL, at the owner of the club. So I want to put this to you in three parts,
okay,
if you don't mind. First of all, how did it happen? How did it come about? Secondly, how was it allowed to happen? And thirdly, how do we stop it happening at another club in the future? Because there's always been that fear. I remember Anna Kirbysley saying that eventually a club will go under and there will be a domino effect. So, first of all, how did it come about, the Bury situation?
Well, Bury have had two owners in recent years. Yeah. One of them's called Stuart Day, and the other one is called Steve Dale, and they're very easy to mix up, so we call them SD1 and SD2.
Okay.
That's not normally the best thing to do. The first guy, SD1, he wanted Bury to be a successful club. Now, Bury...
I'm sorry to interrupt so early, but you say that as though there are some owners who don't want their club to be successful. Isn't that a given?
I think there are some owners who are quite happy for the club just to stay where they are, to make ends meet and survive. And it is a fight for survival in those lower leagues. And the way he tried to, I wouldn't say necessarily buy success, but to increase the chances of success was he actually put money into the club. He increased the wage bill. And Bury, which had made some losses and some profits in recent years, all of a sudden it was losing 50 grand a week.
Right.
That happened for 3 years. And that's fine, provided you've got an owner who every Monday morning writes out a cheque for £50,000. Bob your uncle.
Yeah,
not a problem.
There aren't many other businesses where you can lose £50,000 a week and keep going, are there?
And smile when you've won on the Saturday as well. Yeah. And that's what you're doing it for. How did he have that £50,000 a week? He had that because he ran some other businesses. And then those businesses failed.
Right.
And all of a sudden, his focus was, how am I going to deal with all of this? And And he was in a situation because he was unable to pay the bills because he didn't no longer had the money. At this stage, along comes Steve Dale, SD2, and he buys the club for £1.
Right. Now, again, we will talk about the EFL, and they were very defensive about this. To me, as somebody who's not got an economic breadth, surely alarm bells start to ring when somebody buys a club for £1, don't they? Surely? Somewhere at the EFL, they're going, this is not quite right?
Well, that's right. So what the EFL do at this stage is that they run their first fit and proper test, the owners and directors test, whatever you want to call it. And that test says, are you a crook? Do you have any outstanding convictions? And if you go, no.
I wasn't expecting it to be quite as bold as that, to be honest. But yeah.
And if you satisfy that, they say, right, at this stage, we're not going to do anything else. But what they ask the new owner to do is to say, OK, you just bought the club. Can you prove that you have the funds to run it for the next 2 or 3 years? And Steve Dale hasn't done that. He's refused to do that. He's refused to. He's not provided the EFL with that information. And then 6 weeks after acquiring the club, we get the first stories of wage bills not being paid.
Well, why is there not a mechanism that forces him to do that then? Or takes the club away from him? This is, again, I know to you this is going to sound simplistic and like angry man in public bar, but this is what football fans will be asking. Bury fans will surely be saying, well, why wasn't he made to do it? Are there no sanctions? Are there no...
Are there sanctions? Well, we've seen what the sanctions are.
Well, but, I mean, to an individual who refuses to comply with EFL regulations.
The EFL were given they were given a fait accompli. The company had been sold to somebody else. Now that's all to do with English law.
Right. Okay.
And the EFL cannot override the law of the land.
Sure.
It can say we will not transfer the share to you if you have outstanding convictions.
Right. Okay.
And then it's never been a problem before because every other owner says, "Hey, I've just bought a football club. Here's the information you want."
Sure.
And it was a unique set of circumstances. And I don't know whether you've seen any of the interviews with Steve Dale. He says, "Well, I've never been to Bury. I didn't even know they had a football club." And he initially came in as the saviour, and we've seen that happen to many clubs. Yeah. And the reaction of fans when anybody comes in. I remember going to Ellen Road the day that Ken Bates acquired Leeds United, and the Leeds fans who'd been through an awful lot. They'd been part of this pass the parcel of debt and tragedy from owner to owner to owner. Ken Bates came in, and he was grinning from ear to ear. And and when Ken Bates acquired, Ken Bates is a interesting guy, as we all know.
It's in inverted commas, yes.
Yes, and they thought he was their saviour.
Well, I understand there was a time in the not too distant past when the Gaddafi family were rumoured to be interested in buying Crystal Palace, and I was amazed at the amount of fans who were quite happy at the thought of the Gaddafi family owning Palace if it got us into Europe. No, they weren't particularly bothered by the ramifications of that. But so, of course, I understand why Bury fans would be happy that this guy turns up and they don't ask too many questions, but it's the EFL that should have been asking the questions.
That's right. And the EFL is not innocent in all of this, but at the same time, it had its set of rules, and that set of rules was, OK, Steve, please now provide us with how you're going to run this club. Do you have the resources? Do you have the money in the bank? Because it is losing money. And he said, no, I'm not going to give you that information. And that seemed a bit strange. That was your first reaction. And then the wages stopped being paid. And that continued on and off. And every time the EFL asked for information, Steve Dale said, I'm not going to give it to you. And what do you do under those circumstances? The EFL's own legislation, its own constitution says, well, you've got to do this. And he's just turned round and said, no.
OK. Did the EFL give them long enough, or give him long enough? Or is there anything else they could have done?
Realistically, I think not.
Yeah, okay.
What they could have done was that they could have voted to have given Bury an opportunity to reform in League Two next season.
Okay.
And that vote was taken, and that vote, my understanding is, it was overwhelmingly rejected, and that only one team is going to be relegated from League Two.
So does Bury FC have a legal status now? Does it exist in any shape or form, or is that gone and it's Phoenix Club time?
Well, Bury Football Club Limited continues to exist.
Right.
It is owned by Steve Dale. It has not... Legally, you're supposed to send in your accounts for public scrutiny. It has failed to do that. The government authorities, in theory, they could sort of try to have the company wound up, but it's not their focus. I think the government's got one or two distractions at present. So Bury Football Club's not going to get involved. The local MP, James Frith, he's campaigned.
Very vocal, yes.
He's done all that he can do, realistically. But the EFL clubs, that they've effectively voted for Bury Football Club to be expelled, and that's it. Now, whether they're going to start in the National League or whether they're going to have to go and start at glorified park football in the same way as AFC Wimbledon did, that's only...
So, presumably the EFL clubs, there was no sympathy there. It was purely a business decision on their part that this basket case couldn't continue to be... Would there have been clubs going, hang on, this could happen to us, we need to give them a bit of leeway, a bit of...
I think there was some sympathy from some clubs, but remember Bury were promoted from League Two at the end of last season. Now, there was also resentment, because if you were the club that had finished 7th and missed out on a playoff place,
okay, I understand.
and you're saying, well, actually, this was actually caused by SD1 allowing these losses to be paid, paying wages which can't be sustained. A lot of people were quite angry at Bury being promoted. So they felt, well, hold on, we don't think you should have been promoted from League Two to begin with. So actually putting you back in League Two isn't punishing you at all. So there's those clubs. But also, if you think about it from the perspective, if you were an owner of a club in League Two and you're on the bottom half of that table, and two clubs are going to go down, and you potentially could get kicked out of the Football League, you get relegated, you don't get any money from the Premier League anymore, you're not part of the EFL TV deal, you get a little bit of parachute payments, and you're playing clubs who you've never heard of. If you can reduce that number of relegated clubs from 2 to 1, what are you going to do? What are your fans going to do on the local phone end? So they're going to say, "Oh, okay, be magnanimous here. If we get relegated, people act not in the greater interests of the game. We all become self-interest motivated." So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. If you or I had owned a club who were in the bottom, what would you have done? How would you have voted?
It's depressing, though, because you'd like to think that fans would see the bigger picture and understand. But anyway, it's my favourite stat of the week that Bury have won an away game more recently than Man United, and they no longer exist. There's no consolation for Bury fans. So we know what's happened to the club. I will use the word tragedy and disaster, because as a football fan I think it is. What's going to happen to SD2? I mean, is there any sanction? Does he just carry on his merry way and sleeps happily at night despite what happened to the club?
Well, if you look at his public comments, he does appear to be unfazed by this. He instigated this thing called a creditors' voluntary arrangement. Yeah. I won't get too bogged down in the detail there, but there were lots of strange numbers and strange debts flying left, right and centre.
It's also a way a lot of shop chains are able to lose individual shops rather than going bankrupt themselves, isn't it? So it's playing the game, isn't it? Yes,
and you can make a moral judgment on it, but legally it's a vehicle for arranging the company in a way you want to do so, whilst he still keeps control. Because people say, well, why didn't somebody put the club into administration? If you put a club into administration, all of a sudden the owner loses all the power, and that gets transferred to. And this is what would have happened. You talk about what happened with Palace, with Mark Goldberg and Simon. They lost control of the club when the administrators came in. Steve Dale is still running Bury Football Club on a day-to-day basis. Now, it's got no staff. It does have a stadium. It does have a car park. what's going to happen.
Now, I like to think that the answer to this question is no, but will he be able to buy another football club?
Yes.
Holy mother, really?
Yep. Well, not whilst he owns Bury.
Right, but I do want to move on to a more light-hearted story before we end, but there's two things I would like to ask you. And the first goes back to my romantic view of football. I don't understand why, in a game that has financial problems, you've already begun to explain that to my shock, especially that I can't get over that championship figure. But there is a lot of money in football, in the Premier League in particular. I've never understood why there can't be some kind of benevolent fund whereby clubs, Premier League clubs especially, are forced to donate 1% of their annual turnover into a pot. And if a club is in a situation like this, the EFL, the Premier League, whoever, will step in and say, for at least 6 months, we'll use that money to keep the club going and we'll try and find an owner. And then if we can't at the end of that, then unfortunately economic nature will have to take its course. But I suspect, by the way you're looking at me, that it is a complete romantic pie-in-the-sky idea. Has no one ever considered this type of thing?
I think it has been considered, because what you're effectively saying is similar to what we've seen with Thomas Cook, with Abta and Atoll. So the industry effectively pays a contribution. The reason why the clubs are unwilling to do that, because I think the Premier League feel, and let's face it, the Premier League's an easy target. It does give a lot of money to the lower leagues.
Yes, I understand it does a lot.
And its view was that's simply going to encourage more gambling. So you'll get people coming in, running clubs, and they'll know that if we run the club badly and we don't get promoted or we don't manage to sell it at profit, we can just walk away and the rest of the football industry is going to pick up the tab.
I see.
So that's the view which is taken. You don't get Tesco's supporting local shops who are being destroyed because of what's happening on the high street.
Which, I would say is a shame, basically. And there was some criticism of the Neville brothers, who have a very strong affinity with Bury. Their mother was secretary there for decades, and their father has got a stand named after them. And now they're involved in another football club, so I understand why they couldn't directly help the club. But was there a way that they could have done that? Was a wealthy benefactor the only way out of that problem for Bury?
Realistically, yes, you needed somebody to come in and clear some of those debts, and that would have allowed the club to continue. Now, my understanding, and I did have some involvement with some of the prospective buyers over the summer. We did one or two chats.
Okay. How far did they go?
They spent plenty of money on lawyers' fees and investigation fees. Was that nobody exactly knew what they were buying, because there were various mortgages outstanding.
Oh, crikey.
Mortgage over the stadium, mortgage over parts of the car park.
Parts of the car park?
Parts of the car park had been set out for this very strange scheme. So it was all starting to get very complicated. If you or I were buying a house, we'd like to know what we're buying. So, is the garden included? That's what.
If I just look at it and go, that looks nice. Don't worry about the checks, that's fine. Mrs. Day would be the one doing all the checking. I told you I'm very romantic about these things.
So
parts of the car. I don't. Again, it's back to my initial. I am going to spend a lot of time in this podcast saying, just say that again, because I can't believe what you're telling me. So parts of the car park were mortgaged separately as part of what was the strange scheme?
What they tried to do was to effectively sell individual car park spaces. This was an SD1 scheme.
Okay.
Individual car park spaces to investors, and the money they got from people parking the car there was then paid back to the investors.
Well,
and
no one's getting rich that way,
no, not in Bury.
Well, no, fair point. And that's not flippant, is it? That's a town that's economically distressed. That's how do we stop it? Well, the other thing that's just occurred to me as well is the fact that I was most bemused about was that there was a prospective buyer right at the very end who then said they couldn't do anything over the weekend because their lawyer wasn't back at work till the Tuesday and it was a bank holiday, at which stage it became a kind of Ealing comedy. Because surely, even I thought, if they're serious about this, they would get the lawyer back. So there are phones and emails, aren't there?
And if you pay the lawyers enough money,
of course,
they're prepared to work overtime.
There's never enough money for lawyers to be paid, but it's so frustrating. I understand how Bury fans feel, because as a Palace fan, and there are fans of other clubs who have seen this situation, you see it unfold. You see it step by step happening, and you think there are grown-ups in charge of this, it'll be fine, and then suddenly it isn't. How do other clubs stop this happening to them? Or is it simply impossible? Are we looking at a sad inevitability that football clubs won't look after each other, that football won't look after its own, and that this is not the first club that's going to go down this route? Or is this the wake-up call that 91 other football clubs need?
Well, I think you've got to ask who is running football. So presently, we've got the government, which devolves it, and that's fine. I don't think government should really get involved directly in the running of football. We've got the FA, who have washed their hands of professional football. They just want to do the England team, and they want to do some grassroots, and they want to pick up their sponsors. The FA don't really want to get involved.
That's a pretty big statement.
Well, what have the FA done in terms of Bury? What have the FA done in terms of Macclesfield Town, who are presently being sued by their own players for non-payment of wages?
But there will be lots of people listening to this pod, I guarantee. It's not going to take long for word to get around about this pod. People going, at last, there's somewhere we can find out about this bemusing stuff. But if I was listening to this at home and I suddenly heard you say the FA have pretty much washed their hands of league football, I'd be astonished.
Well, the FA run the FA Cup. Now, all the FA could do is to say to all clubs, if you want to play in our competition next season, if you fail to pay wages, you're going to get kicked out of next year's FA Cup. If you fail to submit your accounts on time, exactly the same happens. If you fail to let the EFL or our own inspectors go in because we are concerned about you, because you've got a county court judgment or something, then perhaps we would have more of a reaction from clubs themselves, because the FA Cup, whilst it has been diminished in many regards, it's still something that, especially if you're a lower league fan and a lower league owner, you get quite excited about, because you're hoping to get an away fixture at Old Trafford.
Well, we saw a club kicked out of the FA Cup this week, didn't we, in Grays, for what it's like VAR. It was technically wrong. It was a player whose registration wasn't correct, but who had played for other clubs. They're out of the FA Cup. What sort of financial impact could that have on them? So being knocked out of the FA Cup, how much of an impact would that have?
I think it was around about £6,500 for Grays that they potentially have lost, because they won't be able to go forward. They were knocked out, or rather, I think they won. Was it the first qualifying round? If you're successful in the second qualifying round, it's £6,750. So they've lost access to that. Now, for a club which is just beyond park football, it's got a nice little stand and so on, that's a lot of money. So it does seem to be pretty harsh, but the FA are quite good at applying rules which are black and white. Where you move into things which are a lot greyer, and this is where we get the accountants and the lawyers arguing the point. You think about what happened at QPR. The QPR resolution took 4 years. If the FA can say, he's not registered and you're out, but then you've got Liverpool having an ineligible player in the Carabao Cup 2 weeks ago, and they've just been fined. So it appears to be there's an inconsistency in the way that football is being run, because we've got the FA, Premier League, and the EFL, and they're all running themselves slightly differently.
I mean, the Liverpool fine thing is ludicrous, because they're not even going to notice it. It's £5 down the back of a sofa that they've lost, essentially, isn't it? So the FA can't get involved. So how do other clubs stop this happening then?
Do other clubs want to stop this happening? Because who makes...
No, to themselves. I mean, how the clubs that are out there in financial trouble, that are frightened by what happened to Bury, what do they do? What do each club do? Can the fans help in any way? I know some clubs like Exeter are owned by fans, but is there any way that fans can get involved, can nudge their owners to say, look, this could happen to us?
Well, I think one of the things we can do as fans is to be a bit more realistic in terms of our ambition. Because if a club loses three or four matches on the trot, you get people on social media, you get people on the phone-ins writing to local newspapers saying, speculate to accumulate.
Yeah.
Now, to me, is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I don't, at the end of each month, and I'm sure you don't do the same, so I don't go home to Mrs. M and say, I'm not paying the mortgage this month, everything's going on scratch cards.
Well, I would never assume anything economically sensible about me. There will be things that you will find out about my finances over this pod that will probably astonish you. But never, that's why economics is a grey area to me, which is why I'm so interested in this. And it's a shame, isn't it, that the only thing that fans can do is to rein in their expectations, because as you we're right back to where we started with the Championship, and because that's the worst offender, isn't it? Those clubs.
It is, but it's also the most exciting division in English football.
Yeah, so you sound like Sky now as well. So, is your instinct then? Is your cold, hard, dispassionate instinct that this is a one-off, Bury, or do you think we're seeing a kind of Darwinian coming to the senses that the more weaker clubs will go to the wall, and the Football League will become smaller but more viable?
There is the potential this season for us to lose one or two more clubs
at that level or higher.
At League One and League Two level, I don't think anything will happen in the Championship. I mean, Bolton were at 11:59 p.m.
Yep.
I appreciate what you said in respect of Palace.
Yep.
Similar thing happened to Villa 2 years ago. But football is incredibly resilient because it has this unique part, as you were saying, as part of working class culture.
Yeah.
People want to come in. People don't want to see Bury destroyed or other clubs who have got similar problems in those lower leagues. But some clubs are really close to the edge at present.
That's distressing too. I mean, Bolton is the salutary lesson to all of us. It's not that long ago I was visiting Bolton as part of Match of the Day 2. They were flourishing in the Premier League, seemed to be a very well-run club, really nice stadium, attracting players of the likes of a Kocher that you wouldn't expect to. And now suddenly, as you say, very, very near extinction. And you kind of think, if it can happen to a club like Bolton, ostensibly a success story, it's probably only Man City and Liverpool that are free from sleepless nights.
I think that's a fair comment. But you said, Djorkaeff, Kocher, Nicholas Anelka, they were fantastic players for Bolton. How is the club affording them? Bolton's losses were £189 million by the time we got to 2016. That had been the losses which had been accumulated during the time they were in the Premier League and since then.
I'm having another eyebrows moment. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Say that again.
They'd accumulated total losses of £189 million. And they had a great owner. They had a guy called Eddie Davis who says, yeah, we don't care. I'm happy to. I live in the Isle of Man. I've made my fortune from selling parts for kettles.
Wow.
He's the world's major kettle component manufacturer, and he just ploughed all of the money into the club. But
so a Blackburn situation essentially with Eddie
with Jack Walker.
Jack Walker, yeah.
But he then started to have failing health, and also he was getting old. And when Bolton were relegated, the fans started to give him a bit of stick, and he's going, "Well, hold on, I've stuck over £150 million into this club, and you're now giving me stick." He'd run the club beyond its means. It'd been losing money every week, and when he stopped, Dean Holdsworth and Ken Anderson came in. All of a sudden, Bolton Wanderers, they're borrowing money from strange banks at 25% a year. You've got Ken Anderson, the owner, paying himself £500,000 a year as a consultant to the club. You've got his son being employed as a consultant on the club on a six-figure sum as well. Things started to go strange. Could the EFL or could the FA have done something more there? Because if you've got a person who's previously been banned from being a director of any company in the UK for 8 years, why do they say, yeah, just come along and take over our club?
I'm going to wrap things up in a moment because, frankly, my eyebrows are getting tired because they've been up and down so often, and I think people listening to this at home need a bit of time to reflect on what we're hearing. And this is what's going to happen week in, week out, because I've just realised how naive and romantic about football I actually am. But I want to end on a lighter story, but it touches on something you just mentioned. most people, if you talk to them about football finances, will immediately say players' wages. Players are paid too much. But we saw a rather bizarre advert this week popped up on an employment opportunities website, amongst other, literally like a postcard in a shop window, offering gardening and haircutting services. And it was for an unnamed club who said they were recently in the Premier League and were now looking to consolidate themselves in League One. There's been a lot of speculation. I don't think we should say out loud who we think it is. But basically, they put an advert in for a striker. And it said this striker should have experience in Championship football. He should be physical. Should be able to hold the ball up. I'm doing a TV show with Peter Crouch at the moment, and we happened to see this advert yesterday, and we were laughing about it, especially some of the spelling. But Crouchy was laughing about the fact that he actually qualified for this position. He's a Championship experience. He's a big, strong player, can hold the ball up. And then he looked at the wages, and he jokingly said, "Well, I'm not going to read any further," because they were offering a salary of £45,000 to £50,000 a year. Now, it says something for all of us that we all initially thought that must mean a week, but we're talking about a player being asked to come to a club for £50,000 a year. That will run contrary to what most people think about players' wages, because I think most people think that even outside the Premier League, players are on a pretty hefty way, and most people will think that the big problem with football clubs financially is players' wages, and in particular relegated teams who have got players at contracted to Premier League wages. But is that advert unusual? Is this a club with no money that's pushing its luck? Or generally outside the Premier League, are players paid the sort of money that a lot of people listening to this would get?
If you look at the Championship wages are out of control, as I mentioned to you earlier. You've got clubs in the Championship who, at the top end, who are not even receiving parachute payments, where the average wage is £20,000 to £25,000 a week.
Wow!
So that's quite considerable. At the same time, you've got clubs at the bottom of the Championship, and realistically, we're talking about the clubs such as Millwall and Barnsley and so on, who will be on a fraction of that. Drop down to League One, which is where we're looking at here, and there is a big gap, because you've got Sunderland and Ipswich, who are clubs that get decent crowds, and also in the case of Sunderland, they're in the receipt of parachute payments for their last time this year. They will have big wage budgets. But you've also got Accrington Stanley, you've got Rochdale and so on, and the players there will be on, the average will be between £1,000 to £1,500 a week for the bottom third of League One, and then that will be broadly similar in League Two, where perhaps the clubs at the top, £2,000 to £3,000 a week. That's still that's still a six-figure income, but you're normally talking about players on 1 and 2 year contracts. And if you actually talk to players themselves, if you're on a 1 year contract and you're earning £70,000 in a League Two club, and it's April and you're going in for a 50-50 and you've got a mortgage, all of a sudden you start thinking twice. And so the wages in the bottom two divisions, they do drop quite considerably. As we know, the Premier League, the average is around about 50. In the Championship, it's going to be around about a quarter of that, and then there'll be another big drop in League One and League Two.
Well, do you know what, Kieran? I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation on a weekly basis, but also part of me is dreading it to an extent, because already I'm learning things that are horrifying me, and I think people listening at home, I hope they will have been entertained by this, but also I think they will be going down the pub and saying to their mates, you really need to listen to this, because it turns out we generally don't know anything about football finances and the way it works. So this has been The Price of Football. I'm Kevin Day. Kieran Maguire has been enlightening us. If you have questions for us, because as the weeks go by, this pod will be based on your questions, and I'm guessing a lot of them are going to be saying, can you say that again? What? How much? Questions at priceoffootball.com, and we look forward to your company next week.
Thank you very much.